We'll get started.
We forgot to tell you.
I know it. I know it. Oh, I had my post-it on the screen, so.
I don't think we needed to record all that anyway. So.
No, we didn't. We didn't. Okay, so I want to welcome everybody. We have 93 people participating. My name's Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and I'm happy today to partner with the New York State DEC Division of Lands and Forests, specifically Rob Messenger and Jason Drobnak, who have been on the road talking about 480A with a lot of different stakeholders, and they wanted to make sure that they had all of their covered as many angles as they could and involved as many people as possible in this discussion. So they've gone to a webinar option, and they're looking to talk with you all about the potential for discussing regulations related to 480A, and then things that might help improve that. So the framework is they have a short presentation, then they're going to open the floor up for questions that you will type into the chat window, and I think I will read to them, or they can read them, and then they'll give a verbal response. They've allocated 2 hours for this, then they lose their space where they're holding their kind of joint presence. And Jason is logged in. You'll hear both Jason and Rob from the same microphone, so, or the sound bar, whatever they're using. So anyway, with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn it over to Rob and Jason. I'll let them give any additional self-introductions they would like, and I'm just going to mute and enjoy the conversation. Thanks very much, guys, for joining and being part of this, hosting it.
Okay, and thank you, Peter. This is Rob Messenger. I'm the Chief of the Bureau of Forest Resource Management here at the Department of Environmental Conservation. Thanks, Peter, for hosting this. For those of you who tried to participate in our last effort at this, hopefully this is a much improved experience. So far, it's working much better than our last effort, so let's hope it continues that way. I just wanted to start by giving a brief history of how we got to where we are at this point. Jason will do the meat of the presentation, but I wanted just to give people just a brief overview of what's happened so far. As Jason will mention, the forest tax law was initially adopted or passed in the mid-70s, and regulations were promulgated soon after that, and essentially have been unmodified since then, meaning that for 45 years we've been working with the same regulations without updating them. So about 5 years ago, my predecessor here at the DEC undertook the effort to do just that, to try to bring them up to a modern status, incorporating fixes that would address issues that both our staff and consulting foresters, as well as landowners enrolled in the program, had raised to us. So at that point, we sought permission from our executive staff, our commissioner and staff up in the top floor, to go ahead with that effort to amend the existing regulations. And they sort of said, well, that's nice, but if you really wanted to do it right, what would you do? How would you really fix this? What do you think you would really need to do to make this program work right? And so at the time they said, well, what we would probably do is make some changes to the law itself, because there's only so much we can do in the regulations. There are provisions in the law that would have to be changed by the legislature. So they proposed that some significant changes, which if you've been paying attention over the past few years, you probably saw what was called the Empire Forests for the Future initiative, and that involved more than just the tax law. It involved some significant changes to the statute. Initially, it would have done away with the existing law and created a new program to replace it. It would have reduced the amount of tax abatement that landowners received, but it would also have reduced the work involved in complying with the requirements of the program to get that tax break. that got introduced to the legislature. It didn't pass. It took us a couple of months or a couple of years to get it into the legislature. It didn't pass. The second time around, the legislature decided that they would keep the existing program, but also create a new program. So it would have both programs, and landowners would have the option to stay in the existing program or move into the new program that involved less work, but you got less tax break. And at that point, we realized that whether or not the legislation passed, we were going to have 480A still in existence. And we started to retool or revamp the effort to modernize those existing regulations. The law didn't pass. The amendment to the law didn't pass. So we're back to kind of square one with the existing regs and the existing law. What that means for us and for you is that we're back to not being able to change everything that really needs to be changed. There are certain things in the statute that we can't change through regulation. The best example I can give you is the 50-acre minimum threshold to qualify for the exemption. That's in the law, and we can't change that through regulations. So that's going to stay the same unless the legislature sees fit to change it. Another one that a lot of people have been worried about is the percent of tax abatement that landowners receive. They're worried that the previous effort for legislation was going to reduce it from 80 to 40%. We can't do that through regulation either. So just to assure everybody, unless the legislature takes action, that 80% will stay the same when this regulation amendment effort is over. That's going to stay the same. So that's just a quick snapshot of the last few years and our efforts to improve this program. And so the next steps are for us, after we finish this webinar, we've created some regional teams to start looking at the regulations. And we decided to, rather than use our regular process, which is normally we would write the new regulations and put them out as draft for public comment, and the affected public would get the chance to comment, let us know where we had missed the mark. We figured it would make more sense for us to talk to those potentially affected parties. Mainly it's landowners, consultant foresters, and our staff, and to a certain degree the town assessors who are involved in the program as well, and see what they wanted fixed in the program, see what we can do in the regulations, so that hopefully when the draft regulations are developed and released for public comment, there isn't as much to address after that. So hopefully we will have been able to address the concerns and issues that folks raise and get it right the first time, so there will be less adjustment to make between the draft and the final regs. So this is sort of this whole process will be a test of how well we're listening and how creative we can be to address all the issues that people want to see us fix. Because some of them are going to be, I don't want to say at odds with each other, but some audiences are going to have a perspective that want to see us fix something one way, and another part of the affected public is going to want to see something that maybe goes in a different direction. So we'll do our best to try to address all of those concerns. But again, we figured it was best to kind of hear those first rather than just do our regulatory drafting in a vacuum, so to speak. So that's where we're at. I will now hand it off to Jason Drobnak. He works in our private lands section here at the DEC, and he'll go through the slideshow for you.
Thank you, Rob. Before we really get started in the presentation, I just wanted to bring up my favorite slide here, which is, what are the benefits of private forests to New Yorkers? And the benefit is 75% of the forest land in New York State overall is privately owned. It's about 14 million acres. And this is why we develop programs for private landowners. We also have a stewardship program as well. And you know, you provide, basically the forest landowner provides, you know, the aesthetics, wildlife, forest products, recreation, clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, those benefits that all forests provide. Most of those benefits you are providing as forest landowners. And that is why we're all here and why we're concerned about creating a better program for everybody. So just wanted to go over that before we got really started into the nuts and bolts. Like Rob had said, forest tax law was enacted in 1974 and has never really been updated. There was a small amendment in 1987, which was a language amendment. And recently there was I think 2008, there was a forest certification amendment, but we have not developed any regulations for that as of yet. And just some basic facts about forest tax law, basic things about the program. Landowners with 50 acres of qualified forest land are eligible. There is a rolling 10-year commitment to the program, which basically means every year that you file a commitment form with the assessor, you are signed up for 10 years of forest management. There is a lien on the deed, so the property, the break and the rules apply to the next landowner. It doesn't go with you. There's up to an 80% reduction of the assessment on the committed acres. So that's the committed acres are the acres that are enrolled in the program. So the forest land itself that we have certified as committed to the program. And the program was developed for the continuous production of forest crops. So, you know, basically traditional timber management. Just as an overview of forest tax law, this map was circa 2015. And this is how the darker areas here represent the higher amount of acreage within the program. So the Adirondacks and the Catskill regions of the state have the highest enrollment and acres, and we can see that. However, in the western part of the state, the enrollment has been increasing percentage-wise throughout the last 10 years or so. And this is statewide statistics for this. So acres enrolled in 48 from in the last 10 years basically have gone up quite a significant amount, as have the certifications themselves. So we've had over 1,000 certifications since 2008 come on board. During this time, our staffing has basically gone down in the private lands programs. So this is one of the reasons why we're here. We have to learn how to get some more efficiencies with administering this program, because I think our enrollment is going to continue to go up as people are interested in getting the tax benefit from the program. Just a quick framework for forest tax law. Robin mentioned this before to some extent. There's the statute or the law. We're not really able to do anything with that during this process. But what we are able to look at is the regulations, you know, that help us manage the program. And we also have a handbook, or it's basically general policy handbook on how we handle those regulations. How do we manage this program? How does our staff manage this program? Most of the regulations have to do with the forest management planning and the forestry itself. And that's what we're really here to talk about today, for the most part. Just really quick, how a landowner would apply for forest tax law is laid out in these 5 steps, basically. So landowner submits new application materials to the regional forester. The application includes a forest management plan written by a private consulting forester. The regional forester would give it to one of their staff members to approve. The certificate of approval would then be sent to the landowner, and the landowner would distribute that package to the local assessor and the county clerk. After they're in, the annual commitment form would be submitted to the local assessor every year after that to receive the tax break. The landowner follows the management plan, continues to apply for the break annually, and then that keeps rolling on. Just really quick, the elements of a forest management plan. We talk a lot about a forest management planning in this program. So a forest management plan is your basic document for the program. So the landowner information is included in that. That includes the tax parcel data. It includes a forest type map with the committed acres mapped out on that map. It breaks the property up into management units. There is a forest inventory completed by a private consultant forester that basically gives us the conditions on the ground at the time of enrollment, and then also at other times throughout the program. There are stand narratives with the goals. The goals of that program, the goals with these stand narratives have to include something with timber management in mind, because that's the charge of the program. There are also prescriptions, which sounds exactly what it is. It's how do you make a stand well again, that kind of thing. So you're a forester will write a prescription before they do a treatment, and then we would approve that prescription along with the notice of commercial cut when you do a treatment within this program. The treatments are laid out in the work schedule, and I'll just go to the next slide here. The treatments are laid out in the work schedule, and this is basically the document that we are regulating this program through. Our foresters will look at the work schedule, see if everybody's up to date on their work. Commercial harvests need a prescription. Non-commercial TSI treatments are on this schedule as well. There's boundary line maintenance, and there's also 5-year updates. So these things are all on the work schedule. They are all the things that we're looking for to keep everybody in compliance with the program. This is the work that needs to be done to basically get the tax break. However, it doesn't always happen that way. There are violations with the program. The violations are laid out in the law, and these are basically the 4 things you can receive a violation for in the program. Partial or full conversion to a non-forestry use. Basically, if you convert the property to a field or to like an ag field, that's a non-forestry use. That's a violation. The owner doesn't give a proper notice of a proposed cutting. So you have to give 30 days before a proposed cutting so we can have the opportunity to review. You can get a violation for that. The owner fails to pay a 6% stumpage owed to the county. That's for a commercial harvest. You can get a violation for not paying that. The owner fails to comply with the approved management plan during the commitment period. So that basically is not following the work schedule and things like that. So those things are in sort of ways the catch-all for everything else besides the first 3. We don't really want violations to occur. The penalties are steep and they're life-changing in some ways. They're 5 times the back taxes with compounding interest going back 10 years for a partial conversion. So if you build a barn on committed acres and it's an acre or 2 acres, you have to pay 5 times the back taxes, compounding interest on those acres going back 10 years. 2.5 times the back taxes with compact years going back 10 years for a full conversion. So if you're in violation of your management plan and you get the whole property gets revoked or gets in violation, then you have to pay that penalty. And these are not recommended. These are not, we do not want people to have this happen to them. And in some ways, that's why we had to try to look at doing a regulation reform for this program. So it's not recommended. However, the rules and regulations are a little outdated. And the reason why is the types of forest landowners in New York State have changed over the years. We have many more absentee landowners. This is their second home. We also have had changes in our New York, in our forest industry. So when the law was first written, we had many more sawmills in the state, small sawmills. We were able to get rid of our low-grade wood easier. That has changed in many parts of the state. It's very hard to get rid of pulpwood right now, generally, and that could be reflected in the difficulty sometimes we get for having people do their harvest. We've also had changes in our staffing versus enrollment. One of the things that I talk about is we had a forester say that a landowner, I called them and said, you know, every time they had a harvest, the DEC forester would come out and meet with the landowner, meet with the private consulting forester every time on their property. And that's changed over the last 20 or so years. And I think we're probably worse for it. We had that relationship, and then we could kind of talk through things a little easier, have a better relationship with everybody involved. There's also been significant changes in New York's forests and the type of forestry needed. This really goes towards the regeneration of our forests. We're having we're having a lot of difficulty regenerating some areas, whether it's due to deer pressure or invasive species. Sometimes it has to do with the type of treatment that's allowed or that's being proposed on the property. Sometimes we need to open it up a little more. That was not necessarily the case when the law was first written. So the main goals of this reform are to improve the landowner and consulting forester education of the program, to create clear requirements and consistent enforcement statewide. So we have different regions in the state, and for the most part, those regions have been allowed to develop their programs kind of on, you know, as they've been, you know, have different workloads, staffing, different types of landowners. In particular, the Adirondacks have a lot of timber management investment organizations, so they have bigger properties. That's a different type of landowner than somebody with 60 acres in the Catskills. So enforcement's a little different there. There's the we also want to reduce the administrative burden, so the paperwork involved in the program. Is there anything in this program we can make more efficient for the landowner, the consultant forester, and us? So we're doing, you know, so we're helping out a little bit on that. We also, this is generally a forestry thing. We always want to improve the forestry outcomes in everything we do, and that's this program too. And it's time to look at the rules and see if there's anything we can change within the rules to help us do our jobs better. This is not the only thing we're doing. This is just part of it. This is the rules and revision of the regulations in the handbook. But we are looking for other things outside of that. We're looking at retraining our staff and providing different types of guidance to our staff on tax law. We're going to have to do that anyway when we change the regs. So that fits naturally into the process. developing some kind of landowner education course or materials, new materials, maybe a better website, things like that fit into that category, as consulting, training, and materials too. So that, you know, those the consultants we could have a better relationship with and provide them with better materials as far as the training goes in tax law. The other thing is we've been hearing throughout this meeting, and one of the things we've been hearing so far is you know, we should be talking to the local assessors and municipal officials more about the program, about the benefits of forest and forestry, because there is some resistance to the program. I don't think we would necessarily be able to fix all of that, but it's always good to have a conversation. Also, just using technology, developing a database, you know, coming up with some efficiencies there. So those are things that are outside of the revisions of the rules and the handbook effort. So one of the things what we did is we went out to the regions and talked to our staff last fall. We also have been taking input from the New York Forest Owners Association and New York State Society of American Foresters and groups like that that are involved in forest tax law. And we've been taking suggestions, and I've been presenting the suggestions as we've been going along on things that would help improve the program. So under the Improving Education banner, we have developing an approved plan writers list. Many states, all the states around in the Northeast have a forest tax law program, and most of them have either licensing or a certified plan writers list. It's usually an either or thing. So we were thinking that maybe that would be something, and we had gotten some suggestions for that. We could also develop an introduction to New York's forest tax law course for landowners, just to educate landowners better about what the program requirements are. Because remember, we're all trying to prevent violations. That's like the overall arching thing we're trying to do here. And we want people to do good forestry. So developing a landowner course is really important, I think. Also, just changing our forms to be more explicit and to educate the landowner on the program, and to really, you know, maybe it's like a Surgeon General's warning situation where at least you know what you're getting into. It's a little more explicit. The current forms aren't really explicit about things. They do say, you know, this is what you're signing up for, but I think we could do a little better on that. That's really outside of the reg change. That would be in the handbook where we could just change the forms. And then also just having contact with our staff before enrollment, talking to them about tax law and what is expected of them. You know, what are our expectations? What are the expectations of the consultant foresters? That all needs to happen. I think most of the time we are in contact with the landowners trying to get into tax law. I just think we will be a little more deliberate about it. So we want to reduce the administrative burdens, right, the paperwork. One of the things is coming up with some kind of notification to us for a sale of a 488 property. That's one of the sticking points. We end up getting a decent amount of violations just from somebody bought a property, they weren't notified that they were in tax law, they didn't even know they were in, and they did something and it became a violation. And it's like, welcome to tax law, here's your violation. And we want to try to prevent that situation in some way. There is, you know, we do get the commitment forms in, and it does have a change of address, and we do catch some of them that way, but we don't catch all of them that way, depending on what time of year it is. So we're looking for some kind of way to fix that. I think we can do it, you know, working with some of the other state agencies or local partners on that. Also, modifying the update and reporting requirements. So that's your 5-year update requirement that we have in the forest tax law now. Many other states have a forest tax law. None of them have a 5-year update, as far as I know, that at least in the states that are Northeast states, and many of them have moved to a 10-year update with like an inspection in between, or at least they have an update that doesn't require a inventory of the harvested stands, things like that. So there's things that can happen within, with that requirement that we can work with. Allowing a more flexible work schedule, and that goes back to talking about how the forests have changed and how the industry has changed. So we're having a hard time getting some of these commercial harvests completed in time. Maybe it's because of the market, maybe it's for other reasons. Why not be more flexible about that? See if we can, put a work window in, maybe 5 or 10-year work window where you'd have that amount of time to get something done, instead of like hammering on everybody about, year-to-year schedule, which is what we are doing now. Allowing electronic submissions, this is sort of a no-brainer. Just developing ways that we can make it more efficient for our staff and the foresters and landowners to interact with us and get the paperwork in. Removing the notarization requirement. That's come up quite a bit so far from landowners as far as notarizing, especially the commitment form year to year, and maybe we don't really need that, and maybe we could go ahead and remove that requirement. Changing the application deadlines. This is really for our staff, allowing them to walk the properties in better weather, especially in the areas of the state that become inaccessible in the wintertime. One of our biggest issues we've had is having clear requirements and a statewide enforcement of the tax law. So, forestry is kind of an it depends type of business. And we have a lot of foresters, they have a lot of different opinions on how things should be done. And generally, I think we should come up with ways that we can all agree on to make this, a little clearer on the requirements of the program, and then they're enforced, consistently throughout the state. Some of the suggestions kind of in this category are developing a forest management plan template. So basically, you're basically setting up a system where we know what a passing grade on a forest management plan is. Also, developing clear data requirements. Some forestry treatments require different types of data that is collected on the field, and coming up with those requirements that would be that would basically again make a passing grade for that type of treatment would be good. Developing a mapping standard. This is basically, we're in 2019. There are a bunch of great GPS mapping free apps out there, and we should be doing a better job with our maps that we're getting in, and more accurate. And the reason is because of the committed acres, and trying to be as accurate as you can on those committed acres. We have to certify the committed acres for the break, and having an accurate map is really key for that. Our people mostly are using GPS for that, but sometimes the maps that are coming in aren't using GPS, so that there's a discrepancy in the accuracy there. This is a big one, revising the boundary line standards. We have 7 different regions that do tax law. We have 7 different boundary line standards, probably more, probably like 9, depending on the foresters. So, some are requiring painting, some aren't. And it mostly has to do with the regional foresters can kind of accept or not accept different types of standards for the boundary lines within tax law that's in the regulations. So we're working on that one. Revising unclear standards, just the general trying to clear up language in the law that's antiquated and maybe it's not clear, or anything that leaves questions about how this program gets enforced. Also, so this is the improving forestry outcomes categories. So adjusting the standards to allow for broader silviculture treatments. There's a thought out there that some of the foresters maybe are looking at some of the basal area and trees per acre requirements to get in the program as something that wouldn't allow a certain silviculture treatment. I don't think that's true, but I think we need to make it more clear within the regs that that's not the way that it should be applied. We should be allowing good sound silviculture regardless of the basal area of the trees per acre. Developing an interfering vegetation standard, or at least addressing the interfering vegetation issue in tax law is important, especially in the regions with a lot of invasive species. So we have invasive species issues, we have fern issues in places, things like that that are not helping with the regeneration of these stands. And we need to do, we'd like to do something about that. We've had a suggestion, maybe this is just making sure it gets addressed in the prescription and it's written out and it's deliberate. Also developing some inventory standards so we can compare different inventories. So sometimes foresters switch in the middle of, like you'll switch foresters within 10 years maybe. So being able to compare one set of inventory to another may make some more efficiencies. Also designating a stand for treatment. Right now, we don't require marking for everything, but maybe we need to come up with some rules where we decide what would be appropriate that you have to mark, what you have to mark, what you have to mark, things like that. And then requiring all tax law management plans to be federal stewardship quality, and that's basically making it so that the people in tax law would qualify for federal cost share dollars that would be available for practices. Keep in mind that these are all suggestions still, and our teams are working on these. And I think we're going to be still taking suggestions after, we're taking it for this webinar, and then we also have an inbox that will be open for a while through the reg process. So that's all I had for the presentation. Thank you for coming today and listening. I apologize for the lousy webinar from before, but Peter has helped us out quite a bit on this, and we really appreciate it. I'm going to leave this up. This is I left the box to send our inbox for the reg changes up here for everybody to look at. So I guess we're opening up to questions at this point, Pete.
That's right. Thank you. That was a great presentation. I appreciate it. I learned a lot. And I just typed in that email address that's on the presentation window into the chat window. So, so this is for the audience. This is the chance for you to type in questions. And we already have several questions. So I'm going to scroll back to the top and we'll start from the top down. And Jason and Rob, do you want me to read them to you? Is that the easiest way to do it?
Yeah, that would be great, Peter.
Okay. So the first question is, if someone is a certified forester and they own forest property in New York, can they write their own management plan when applying for a 480A tax deduction?
Absolutely. Yep. So the plan has to be written by a forester, but there's nothing that says that forester can't be the owner. So, yep, simple answer is yes.
Okay. All right. And then looks like we have people from almost every county.
Great.
Yeah, there's 100, and at the high end, we had 129 participants. I'm just looking for, next question is whether this PowerPoint will be available as a handout.
As a handout, we are planning to post it online.
It's up now.
It is, okay.
Yeah, it's up now, and you can link to it. It's at the website that's showing on the screen right now, and it's up there right now. So you can print off from that.
Okay, I'm going to type that in. I just can't type and talk at the same time. So
Okay.
I can barely do one at a time, much less both. All right, so hopefully I got that correctly. Input. Okay, now, next question. At one point you mentioned a handbook. I think it's a handbook that foresters use. Is that, or where are those available? How does one get a copy of that handbook?
Yep. So the handbook is a guidance document that we have maintained. It was originally intended for DEC staff. We are going to update it, and it will be available online to DEC staff and consultant foresters and landowners. The idea being that it will include clarifications of things, just added stuff that doesn't necessarily doesn't rise to the level of needing to be a regulation, because it's not something that would be necessarily enforced, but things that would be helpful to everybody to know, so everybody's on the same page and understands what's expected. Is it online right now?
It's on that website.
Okay, so again, on that website that you can currently see, the dec.ny.gov/lands/5236.html, the handbook is linked to that page right there.
Okay. And next question, how does an aspiring consulting forester formally learn about the process of taking the landowner through the 480A process? Is there a course available to learn the intricacies or writing of plans for landowners?
There is not currently a course. As Jason mentioned during the presentation, that's something we are considering implementing. At present, if someone is either establishing or has established their own consulting business, I would recommend they start by contacting the appropriate regional forester nearest them for maybe just a sit down and have that regional forester take them through the requirements of the program. And that would be a really good start, and go from there. I would think if we have a course developed, since we're looking at not having these regs done until probably beginning of 2020, the course probably would not be finished and ready to be implemented until mid 2020, if maybe not even 2021, depending on what it turns out to be. So initial for someone right now is to contact one of our regional foresters and just have a good sit down with them about the program.
Okay. Next question, what happens if a management program needs to be changed because of, you can add in whatever you want, the example given was invasive pests such as emerald ash borer? Is
Sure.
the landowner penalized, or is there an option for variance that can be granted?
Absolutely. If you look at the regulations and the statute, amending the approved management plan is actually quite a simple process. It simply says that the landowner needs to notify the regional forester and tell them what they need to amend, and assuming that it's a reasonable change, the regional forester simply sends them a letter back saying, yes, your change has been accepted and your approved management plan has been updated. where people often run into trouble is when they take action that does not comply with that plan, and it may be a reasonable action, but they haven't notified us that they're changing their plan. So that's when you might see a penalty invoked because they went ahead and did something that either wasn't included in the plan or didn't do something that was included in the plan. That's when a penalty comes into play. But yeah, if something, what this person's probably talking about, it's not uncommon these days, is perhaps there's a new infestation of emerald ash borer found near their property, and they have a lot of ash. They would like to preemptively salvage that ash before it dies and get that value. Then what they would do is either they or their consultant forester would send a letter to the regional forester saying we'd like to change either the work schedule or the management plan. We'd like to harvest the ash now. And in most cases, the regional forester is going to say, yeah, that's a reasonable change. Let's go ahead and update the plan.
Okay. And I'd like to thank, from my perspective, the people writing the questions are doing a very good job at this. So they're making it easy for me. I don't have to interpret anything. Yeah. So next question, how does being enrolled in 480A impact tax benefits relative to a conservation easement on the property? So I think, which is better for the landowner, the 480A or a conservation easement?
Right. Conservation easement.
What? No. Let me. So no. I think they're. Let me. I think they want to know if there's a conflict between having 480A and having a conservation easement.
There is not. There is nothing that says you can't enroll in the 480A program if you have a conservation easement, and there's nothing that says if you are enrolled in the tax law that you can't convey a conservation easement to the department. So they are not mutually exclusive. I can't tell you how they would impact each other because conservation easements vary throughout the state as to what the conservation easement might do to the landowner's tax burden. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure exactly how the interplay works out, but you can be enrolled in the tax law if you have a conservation easement on your property.
So I'm assuming, and I'm not especially fluent in conservation easements, but it's conceivable that you could have a conservation easement that places some level of restriction on harvesting. Would that be incompatible with 480A?
It could, since you haven't specified the restriction on harvesting. If you say if the conservation easement said that there would be no harvesting on the property, then yes, or I should say no, we probably would not accept that as being enrolled for enrollment in the program. The heart of the tax law program is, even though it may not apply today, when the law was adopted, a major part of the reason for it was to encourage landowners to supply raw fiber for the forest industries in New York. So a conservation easement that says there will be no harvesting on the property is sort of antithetical to that.
Right. So I guess the devil's in the details, and so if somebody wants to have both 480A and a conservation easement, they need to have that conversation with their regional forester, and especially if they have yet to sign the easement, they need to have a sit down with all the people involved, probably.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, good. Next question. If there are no licensing or certification requirements for foresters in New York State, what are the minimum requirements to be included on the approved plan writers list?
So since that's a proposal, we don't really know yet. Currently, under the regulations, there is a definition of forester, and so those can be found in the regulations online. So yeah, that's something that we have yet to develop, is what would, I would expect it would be something similar, that not only would you have to meet those minimum requirements of being a forester or possibly a forestry technician. And the course, the course to be on the plan writers list would not really be educating anybody about forestry. It would mainly be about educating those qualified forestry professionals as to what is expected from them in the quality of the plans that they are submitting.
Okay. Next question. Let's see. So there's one about a deadline, but I'm not sure what the says. Is there a deadline for this yet? And I'm not sure what this is. So if that person is still connected, they can maybe rewrite that question and explain what the deadline refers to.
Well, so there's a couple things it could be, and this may answer their question. The deadline for comments, there isn't one right now. Any relevant comments we're happy to accept, and until such time as we actually put the draft regs out for public comment, and even after that, they may be relevant. And in terms of is there a deadline for us to get the regulations done? We have a timeline. They're hoping to get these regulations adopted prior to March 1st next year, because that would give everybody, so we would adopt them prior to March 1st, 2020, and they would go into effect March 1st, 2021, so that everybody enrolled or any forester working in the program would have a full year to make any adjustments necessary to comply with the regulations. So that's sort of our deadline for the department. If the person is asking about a different deadline, then yeah, they can clarify that question.
Okay. Next question, is it possible to be in 480A if you want to preserve a forest for carbon sequestration benefits instead of for a timber crop?
Right, so that question has been asked, and we really are not sure of the answer. It kind of goes back to that question about the easement. As I referenced before, the idea of the law initially was to encourage landowners to harvest timber. But we do recognize the value to the planet, to our society, that trees provide by sucking up all that carbon and holding on to it. So right now, under the law and the regulations, the person is committing their property, or at least a portion of their property, to producing a merchantable forest crop. The question then sort of becomes is, can we say carbon sequestration is that crop if someone is being compensated for sequestering the carbon? So unfortunately, I can't give them a really definite answer right now. It's something that we've been asked to consider, and we will try to figure out if that's something that we can fit within the bounds of the statute that we are currently working under.
Okay. And the next question was essentially the same as that by a different person. It was just referring to ecosystem services, but I'm assuming the same answer would apply.
Yep.
So next question, what are the variables that affect whether the 80% reduction is actually granted by the local assessor? If you look at the law, there's actually a formula, I believe. And in most cases, if the abatement is granted by the local assessor, there's a formula. In most cases, it's 80%, but it may be as low as something like 76% or 75%. I don't know the formula off the top of my head. And I don't even know what the factors are that go into it. The assessor does have, if you read the statute, there is a phrase within the statute that says if the assessor is satisfied that the landowner has met all the requirements, then they shall grant the tax abatement. So they do have some discretion, and if you read the statute, it's actually fairly broad. But I think if they were to simply say, no, we don't feel like giving people a tax break in our town, they would have a tough time justifying that to a judge. They would have to show that the landowner actually had not satisfied the requirements under the law. And that's kind of tough to do.
If the landowner has shown to the DEC that they have met their requirements and we've approved their management plan, I think it would be very difficult for the assessor to say, no, I'm not going to grant the abatement.
Okay. Next question. Will there be a change to the definition of traditional forest products? Specifically, can maple syrup be considered a forest product with the changes that are proposed or within the regulation?
We have not allowed that yet. Again, that's another one that's been asked of us. And I guess it kind of falls into that same category. It's one can argue that even trees that have been tapped would have some marginal merchantable value once they reach maturity and could be sold as either, well, they could even be sawn as cut as firewood and be considered a merchantable forest crop. I think it's doubtful that we would go the route of allowing maple syrup to be called a merchantable forest crop, even though obviously by definition it's a crop that is produced in a forest and can be paid for. Again, I would refer back to the idea that this was really about getting people to harvest timber for the forest industries. I'm not saying it's something I'm ruling out 100%, but I don't think it's something that we're strongly considering at this time.
So just I'll add commentary on that if I can.
Sure.
We had a timber sale in in a section of the 30-acre section of Sugarbush at Cornell's Arnott Forest, and we sold. It had been tapped since the 50s, and we sold all of those butt logs as saw timber.
Wow.
So it's. I mean, it was certainly some of them didn't come out of the woods at all, but that was not because they were tapped. It was because there were other things going on with them. But it's a niche market, and small, but it's called tap hole lumber, and it's really pretty lumber, and people make furniture out of it. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question. Our club currently has a trailer on our 480A property. We're considering replacing it with a cabin. Do we need to notify the town assessor and DEC?
Well, the assessor would be notified eventually. First thing I would say is more important is to notify us. Historically, the way we have treated buildings is that any building, essentially, we remove 1 acre of associated property from enrollment. Assuming that the trailer is actually on committed acres, then we would probably wind up revoking 1 acre of enrolled property for that club when they constructed the building. And that would be with the associated penalty. So for that acre, the abatement would be removed, and the club would have to reimburse the county the tax savings that they had realized with interest for the past 10 years. So just hypothetically, if the club was at exactly 50 acres and converting that acre brought them below the 50-acre threshold, then the entire property becomes ineligible, and the whole thing would be revoked. But assuming that they are 51 acres or more, then the rest of the property could stay in. Did I explain that penalty? It's 5 times the tax for a partial conversion. It's 5 times the tax savings plus interest. So it is substantial.
Okay.
Another way to do it, I mean, would be longer term. If they're looking farther out into the future, and they could wait long enough, or if they could wait a little while, they could reduce that penalty by essentially taking that acre where they're going to put the building and carve it out currently. So tell us that they are not going to commit that acre next year. So that acre is committed with the rest of the property or the rest of the enrolled acres for the next 10 years. So if they take it out now and follow the management plan for the next 10 years, once that 10 years is up, now that acre is free and clear and they can put the building on it without penalty. So if they want to take that acre out now, but maybe they're not going to build for 2 or 3 years, if they take it out now and follow the management plan, every year that they follow the management plan, they're going to reduce that penalty. I don't want to try to explain this too much more, because it's something that they really should talk to the regional forester about, and their options for how they could avoid some of the penalty by timing what they do when. But if they were to just put up the building now, you know, sometime this year, then yes, there would be a significant penalty on that acre that we would withdraw for the conversion of the property.
Can I just make a comment?
Sure, can.
All of what Rob just said is based on the premise that this trailer is on committed acreage. If it's not on committed acreage, then there's no penalty that will apply.
So that didn't sound like Jason.
Oh no, that's Barbara Lucas Wilson. She's not in our private lands program anymore, but she had a bunch of field experience in the tax law program and was just here listening to the presentation we've been providing.
I knew that wasn't Jason. That was just hi, Barbara. Welcome. Next, so there's a comment and a question. The comment is, DEC should go ahead with the online annual commitment process as soon as possible. So that's encouragement for that, or a vote of support for that. And then the question is, notarization in the statute?
No, that's why we can possibly make the change to the regulations. Matter of fact, there isn't even anything in the regulations that says anything has to be notarized. It's just that whenever whoever wrote the forms that we use, they put a spot on there for notarization. I'm not going to, or we're not going to just eliminate that notarization without speaking with our attorneys to get some guidance from them as to what the risk is if we don't have people notarize their signatures. But yeah, it's not in the statute.
Okay. Is there so this doesn't appear to be specific to 488. It says, is there an approved list in New York for foresters, and how do you get on that list?
There is not. There is the cooperating forester program, cooperating consulting forester program, but you do not have to be on the cooperating consultant forester list to write plans for tax law right now. The only thing you have to do if you're going to write plans is meet the definition found in the regulations of a forester.
Okay. And so if they were interested in the cooperating forester list, they could go online and look for that and get information about how to be included on it. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yep. That information is found on our website.
Okay. Next question. Jason mentioned some New York State mapping tools that were online and that are free. And question is, can you put up links to those, or how do they find those mapping tools?
Yeah, we can maybe look at putting up some mapping tools
on that. And that could you add those to the website that's listed on the screen?
I think so, yeah.
The 5236.
I heard you say state software.
So just New York State mapping. So,
yeah,
so it's not necessarily state tools, but they're mapping tools in New York State that are online and free.
Right.
Okay. Next question. Is there a criteria for minimum size of forest connecting contiguous tracts? For example, 2 30-acre forests connected by a hedgerow. How wide would the hedgerow need to be, and could it be a corridor that was planted with trees for the purpose of making the 2 tracts contiguous?
So the hedgerow, this is Jason, this is the hedgerow, that's something we need to define in the regs a little further too, because for obvious reasons, how wide do you need it to be manageable under a forest management program. So we are looking at what, we don't know the answer to that right now. Traditionally, when I was a forester, it's hard to say what the answer would be to that, but how wide would it be to manage for forest products, I guess is the answer. And that's why we need to define it better, is because I can't come up with a straight answer for that one.
Next question is will the online annual commitment process also be available to the local assessor for exemption renewals?
We're really hoping so, but that's really up to them. We don't have any authority over them, but we are going to be discussing with the Assessors Association some of the changes that we're contemplating and hoping that they'll be on board and recognizing that there's a benefit to them to work with us on implementing these changes. So that's our hope, but you really would have to talk to the assessors. And I mean, people don't need to go talk to their assessor. I suppose if they want to mention it to their assessor and put the bug in there, that'd be great. But we'll need to work that out with the assessors. And it's our hope that the answer will be yes, but we can't say that for sure right now.
Okay. So clarification on the earlier question about easements. So the clarification is, does 480A impact the tax benefits of a conservation easement?
It could. It really depends on the terms of the easement. So this is what I was talking about when I said easements vary throughout the state. So if the landowner has an easement with the state and part of the terms of the easement say that the state will carry part of the tax burden, then 480A, the 80% tax abatement, I think, and I probably shouldn't say this because I'm not positive about this, but I think the tax abatement would only apply to the portion of the taxes that are paid by the landowner. So that's probably about as far as I ought to say, because I've never dug into the details of that because every easement can be different. So I would say that it could, but if the person either is enrolled in the tax law and wants to enter into an easement or has an easement on their property and wants to enroll, they really need to either talk with with the regional forester or contact us in Albany and discuss the real specifics of their situation to figure out what the impacts would be. Because there's just too many variables that can go into the terms of a conservation easement that would affect the answer to that question.
Okay. Next question, I think you've already addressed, but will the definition of forest crop be broadened to include non-timber crops such as maple syrup, shiitake mushrooms, ginseng, or silvopasture?
Right. Yeah, I think we've already addressed that.
Yep.
The answer is we're not sure yet, but probably going to continue to focus on timber.
This is a landowner says, if I enter the program now, what happens when the new program starts in 2020?
So as I tried to explain before, the intention is to have the regulations adopted prior to March 1st, which is taxable status date in most counties. So that, and then they would go into effect in 2021 for tax year 2021. So let's say someone is currently enrolled in the program. If the regs are adopted on the schedule that we are hoping that we can do, their management plan wouldn't have to be changed until 2021 for them to continue to comply with the new regulations. So
okay.
for calendar year and tax year 2020, they would be working under their current approved management plan.
Okay. All right. Next question. Are a landowner's 480A requirement satisfied for a certain number of years after completing a commercial harvest?
So that really depends on what is in their management plan. If they have, for instance, if they have a timber harvest scheduled for, let's say, 2019, and they conduct that harvest, but they don't have another harvest scheduled until 2025, then that's probably true. They will need, under the current regulations, they would need to update their management plan because management plans have to be updated every 5 years. But the question doesn't really reflect, or doesn't have enough nuance to reflect the current program. There isn't a set of work requirements that apply to everybody. It's what you are required to do for work on your property is all tied to your approved management plan, and that is tied to the condition of your forest. If you have a lot of very young forest that doesn't need to be thinned and doesn't need to have any work in order for it to continue to grow and develop into merchantable crops, then you may not have anything on your work schedule for the next 10 years. So it really depends on what you've got for forest and what your goals are as a landowner, what crops you are intending to produce. And that all goes into what you and your forester propose as a work schedule, and assuming we approve that work schedule, then that's what you're required to do.
Okay. Next question says, you have outlined an ambitious program of revisions. It would help to get some sense of what your priorities are. For example, landowner education, handbook update, ? Electronic submissions, ? Management plan template, ? So is there a prioritized list, or is it the plan to have it all done by March 1 of 2020?
Well, the priority is the regulations, because those will then, if we get them adopted on the schedule that we are proposing, it gives everybody a year to retool and adjust. So getting those in place is the first step. We're hoping that once we get the draft regulations released sometime this fall for public comment, after we all go on vacation for a couple of weeks and drink some Mai Tais on the beach, we can then take some time to work on the handbook and make adjustments there, or start to draft adjustments for that, and work on some of those other things that will come along and need to be implemented once the regs are adopted. But yeah, the regs are first, and all those other things that were listed, and some others as well, will sort of follow after.
Okay. What is the next question? What is the minimum timber harvest required to fulfill the timber harvest requirement?
There isn't one. And I guess that kind of goes back to the previous question about fulfilling the landowner's requirements. It really depends on what your forest is composed of and what stage of development it's at. There isn't a board foot requirement or an acreage requirement. It's really tied to what your property looks like, what your forest looks like, and what your goals are.
Okay. Next question. Will acreage in hemp production be eligible for tax abatement?
I don't see any room for that. I don't believe hemp is considered a forest crop. If they're talking about growing hemp under a forest canopy, it could be, I suppose, allowed, so long as the hemp production would have to be considered a compatible use. As long as the hemp production does not deter or reduce the production of forest crops, then it could be allowed, but the production of the hemp would not be would not meet the eligibility for, if that was all they were growing, they couldn't get the forest tax law abatement for that.
Okay. Okay, next question. If someone wants to remove themselves from 480A, must they abide by the management plan for 10 years without tax abatement, or would the tax abatement still apply for those 10 years?
No, that person has basically just put their finger on how you withdraw voluntarily from the program without penalty. That's it. What they describe is exactly what you have to do. You stop filing for stop filing your annual commitment, and abide by the management plan for the next, actually it would be 9 years, because if you got your tax abatement this year, you've lived up to the plan for this year, and then for the next 9 years abide by the management plan. After that, we send a notice of revocation to the county clerk, and they remove the lien from the property, and there is no penalty. You can voluntarily withdraw with penalty. Basically tell us that you want out, and whatever you're going to do with the property is worth more to you than whatever penalty it is that you're going to invoke, and the penalty would be assessed, and you'd be out there. The lien would be removed from your property sooner, but you'd pay a hefty penalty.
I would always recommend talking to the county treasurer before you did that, though. Make sure you can get them to give you a calculation on that penalty.
Yeah.
Okay. Next is a statement, I guess. The penal law has sanctions built in for misleading a state agency. If it is reasonable for agency to rely, if it's reasonable for the agency to rely on self-certification, so notarization is unnecessary.
That may very well be true. Not being an attorney, it certainly sounds like that person has a cogent argument, and I'm sincerely hope that they are correct, because we'd really like to do away with that. A lot of people are saying they find the notarization requirement to be onerous, and so I appreciate them bringing up actually a citation of statute that helps us support that idea.
Okay. So a follow-up on the hedgerow question: who will decide the answer to the characteristics of what constitutes a legitimate hedgerow? So this is a landowner wants to apply to the program. So
well, for the revisions, we're all, that's in our wheelhouse for the teams to look at. Right now, it's by each regional forester what they are considering a hedgerow or not.
Yeah, there's a lot of discretion left to the regional foresters in some portions of the regs, and that's why we've gotten some inconsistent interpretations and enforcement throughout the state. Ultimately, if I understand what they're asking, it's the department's decision. Whether they're asking what will go into the regs, obviously, we will decide after taking all comments and input into consideration. If we can develop a regulation that clearly specifies how wide a strip of trees has to be considered a forest, we'll do that. But yeah, if there's still some unclarity to the regulations, it will probably devolve to being up to the regional forester. And that, I guess that brings up another point that we've been asked to try to develop, and I don't think it was in the presentation, is the possibility of some sort of appeal process for situations such as that, or for other interpretations of the regulation that either the consulting forester or the landowner disagree with. Right now, it's informal. Someone could always write to us in Albany and say, hey, we think that this decision is inappropriate, we'd like you to step in, but there's no formal process. And it might be something that we're starting to toy with, the idea of making that formal, so that if you don't like the decision that you got from the regional forester, there's a specific process to follow to try to state your case and see if you can have it changed.
Okay. Next question, does the state reimburse or compensate the local taxing authority for the reduced tax base after a 480A reduction is granted to a landowner?
That was actually proposed in the legislative package that we were working on. Currently, there are certain towns that are reimbursed. I'm trying to avoid getting into too much detail. There was a statute passed in 2008, I think, that used the abatement, the number of enrolled acres at the time, or the amount of tax abatement at that time, and provided reimbursement to towns
for which their tax base was shifted more than 1%. So when you get a tax break, well, one landowner gets a tax break, the town still needs that money to balance their budget. So the burden of that tax is shifted to the other landowners in that town. So if that shift was over 1%, those towns were reimbursed. But the statute that was passed did not allow for adjustment of that. So currently there are towns that have had more people enroll and their tax shift has increased. They weren't over 1% at the time. They are now, but the law didn't account for that. So they are not being reimbursed. There's other towns that were reimbursed at that time and they lost enrolled acres. So they're not over 1%, but they're still getting reimbursed. We had proposed to fix that, but it didn't pass. So that's the current situation, and that's why a lot of towns object to the tax law program, is because they don't get reimbursed for the tax shift. Not specifically by us. It would have to be enacted in the legislature to create a system by which any town gets reimbursed other than what they're currently getting reimbursed.
Okay. So here's a comment about the 230-acre parcels. Says the spirit of the program should be to manage 60 acres on contiguous parcels, not 2 30-acre stands that are required to somehow physically touch.
If I understand the comment correct, I would agree with that. The law says that they have to be contiguous. And this kind of goes towards a philosophical discussion that we've had. There are folks who say that nobody should get a tax break unless they meet the exact letter of the law. And so we should be trying to make sure that nobody gets a tax break that doesn't deserve it. There are other folks who are saying, look, the spirit of the law is to try to get people to do good forestry, and they don't exactly meet the law. Well, do we really need to be that strict? And I think we need to kind of get down the middle of the road there, because I agree. If someone else is someone's getting a tax break that they haven't met all the requirements exactly, well, their neighbors are picking up the tax burden for them, and that's not really fair to them. The law was set up the way it was for a reason. At the same time, things have changed since that law was passed. It's been 45 years, and meeting those requirements is a little bit difficult in some cases than it was back then. So, yeah, it's that idea of the two parcels that don't meet the minimum acreage being connected by a line of trees. I think we all would agree that if it's just a single line of trees, that's not a forest. When does a strip of trees become wide enough to meet the ecological conditions that we would call a forest ecosystem? Maybe we have to rely on science. Maybe I don't know where else we would go, but it's a touchy one. That's one that unfortunately is going to continue to be kind of controversial. I don't imagine that we're going to satisfy everybody with the spot that we land on there, but we will do our best.
Okay. Next question. If my plan is up for a 5-year update this year and the regs are changing, requiring another update, can I get an extension for the 5-year update to avoid the cost associated with the forester doing the update twice?
I guess I haven't really thought of that. That's a really good question. Depending on what we change, they might not need another update, because one of the things that Jason mentioned was that idea of a 10-year work window. So we might be able to simply make a simple amendment to their plan that changes their annual work plan to a 10-year work window that includes all the work in the first 10 years. So they may not need an extension, but I think we would certainly consider a way to accommodate folks that were
as the person points out, they are incurring an expense now to meet the current regulations and would have another expense to comply with the new regulations. We'll have to figure out how we're going to address that. But I agree with their point that it's unfair to the landowners to make them pay more money because we're changing the regulations. So.
Okay. Next question, if acreage is split by a county road and field between forest tracts but is considered one tax parcel, is it contiguous or not?
I'm not sure about the field. It's specifically in the regulations, and I think in the statute as well, it defines contiguous, and if it's separated by a road, it's considered contiguous. I'm not sure about the field though.
I guess that would depend on the field. If the field goes edge to edge on the property,
yeah.
then you're back
Okay.
to the
one parcel that's got a field and two forests. It's contiguous.
Okay.
Okay. So there's some commentaries between participants that I will skip, and
Okay.
some repeat questions that I will not refer to. Just I'm conscious that we're down to 33 minutes left. So, okay. I have a 5-year 480A update required in 2020. Okay, so that was essentially, I think this is the same question.
Yeah.
As for a 5-year 480A update required in 2020, as well as a re-inventory of all stands, but I have to pay my forester for that and also pay my forester for new plan in 2021.
Right. Yeah. Well, that is something we'll have to figure out. And with the idea that, apologies for not being able to provide them a definite answer right now, but yes, we will try to avoid, if at all possible, the need for someone to pay their forester extra time to adjust to the new regulations.
Okay. This is about the definition of contiguous. Does contiguous refer more directly to tax parcels, not forest stands?
My understanding is that it is to the forest stands. It sounds like there is there may be some difference of opinions out there in the regions. I've always interpreted it to mean that the forest itself has to be contiguous.
Okay. I'm not sure I understand this question. Maybe you do. Do the ownerships or forest stands have to be contiguous?
I think that's similar to the previous question. The ownership has to be the same. It could be two separate tax parcels, but if the owner is the same, it doesn't have to be all one tax parcel. As for the forest stands, if you had a 100-acre property and 4 25-acre or 4 15-acre forests that were separated by fields, I thought those were considered non-contiguous. But Jason said,
no, I disagree. I think that would be considered part of the program.
Anyway,
absolutely. It's 50 acres. Right.
So if a landowner or a forester has a situation where there's some question about the contiguousness, if that's the right word, how should they proceed? To start first with their regional forester?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. We're actually in pretty good shape, but my screen said there were 28 more questions, but there's only like 2 more. So next question. Are there standing advisory committees to your Bureau or the Division of Lands and Forests that include private and especially small private landowners?
No, there used to be what was called the Forest Practice Board, and I think some regions use those for this kind of thing, but those were done away with quite a while ago. But no, there are not standing advisory committees right now. That's not a bad idea, actually, to create something like that.
Okay. Then there's I'm not going to read it, but it sounds like, so here's a copy and paste from part 199 about the definition of contiguous. It's sent to all panelists and attendees, so I'll let all the others read that. So
that's great. Well, thank you to whoever did that. It's good, so everybody has the language from the regulations.
So that's all the questions.
Okay.
And I think, so I guess we can pause here for like 3 or 4 seconds. And if somebody wants to, I mean, they've had a long time to be thinking of questions. We don't need to pause for too very long, but you guys did a great job responding to those questions, guys and gal. And I appreciate the clarity of that. And again, to the audience, the questions were really well written. So my appreciation to you for being thoughtful and putting those together. So there are some thank yous popping up to you for a fine and informative discussion, which I will second. And I think with that, I'm going to turn off the recording and we can call this webinar closed.
Terrific. Thank you
All
again.
right.
Peter.
Yes.